Welcome to Magic Beyond the Books. Today I am talking about Griphook the Goblin. I'm Renee. Warning, there are Harry Potter spoilers from all of the books in this episode. Character summary. Griphook, a Gringotts goblin, takes Harry to his vault on his first trip to Diagon Alley. Later, Griphook assists Harry in an elaborate bank heist. Listener question of the week. Today's listener question of the week is, can you sort the penguins of Madagascar into Hogwarts houses? Which penguin best represents each house? And this is a reference to the movie Madagascar and then the spin-off TV and movie and stuff about the penguins specifically. If you haven't watched those, you'll need to watch those for reference. But I think this is an easy one. Sort the penguins of Madagascar into the Hogwarts houses. I'm going to start with the most obvious, Kowalski. He's obviously Ravenclaw. Brainy and strategist. He's a scientist. No questions there. Next, Private. Private is just happy to be there. He's definitely a Hufflepuff. He's the youngest of the group. He's very endearing and cute, and he just kind of goes along with the rest of the group. So Hufflepuff for him. Skipper, you might think Gryffindor, but no, Skipper is a Slytherin. He's the group leader. He's very ambitious and witty. And finally, that leaves Rico. He is a Gryffindor. Rico is their weapons specialist, and he's literally all action and no talk. He doesn't speak at all. He just hacks up things and handles all their explosives. So he is 100% a Gryffindor. And that concludes the Penguins of Madagascar in Hogwarts houses. So Kowalski, Ravenclaw, Private, Hufflepuff, Skipper, Slytherin, and finally Rico and Gryffindor. Now let's get back to the episode. So Griphook is our very first goblin on this podcast, and I think it's good to kind of go into the background of goblins, and I think there's a lot that goes into his character and the history of goblins. So first, I'm going to go way out into just goblins and folklore in general, not even like we're going outside of Harry Potter here. The word goblin, there's Greek roots for that word, and it means wicked sprite. In the 12th century Normandy, goblin referred to a devil that haunted the countryside. And then early goblin lore is heavily tied with fae, which fairies, like the pointed ears. So from what I found, a lot of the folklore, kind of the two of them are linked, and I'll get into some examples. But sometimes they're portrayed as just like benign household spirits, like brownies or hobgoblins. They're just like, which performed basic chores in exchange for food and drink, but, got mischievous a little bit. If they got offended, they might do little things, but they're not like always super devilish. And then some myths portrayed them as more malevolent. They're often depicted with like grotesque features, sickly looking, like off-color skin, warts, boils, a shorter stature, a lot of the times, not all the time, and longer noses and pointed ears. And then they have this heavy desire for gold and treasure, shiny objects, and would resort to extreme cruelty to obtain those treasures. Actually, I found out, which I didn't realize, but Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he used goblin actually interchangeably with orcs, which were orcs in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were previously elves. So that gets your like tie into like the fae kind of stuff. But I thought this was interesting because orcs in Lord of the Rings are very different, and elves are both very different than goblins and elves in Harry Potter, and how they're depicted. For example, like orcs and elves being more human-sized, not so short in Lord of the Rings. And then just like so many things, like elves are, beautiful. Think more Orlando Bloom, less Dobby. So interesting tie there. But basically, goblins in folklore, how they're described, the appearance most times, and then a lot of the behavior and the tie to, treasure and gold and things like that, it seems like J.K. Rowling really just kind of copied and pasted that into the Goblins of Gringotts. She obviously associated with them with Gringotts and treasure in Harry Potter. So let's transition into goblins in Harry Potter. So in Harry Potter, goblins are highly intelligent. They're humanoid beings with long fingers and feet, shorter than humans, but slightly larger than house elves, if you're looking on like the scale there. So Griphook is going to be taller than Dobby, but shorter than Harry, you know. They're very fair-skinned, and that's usually due to the fact that they're usually underground or out of sunlight, you know, not really tanning in the sun. They coexist with wizards in the magical world, and their diet consists of meat, roots, and fungi. They speak their own language, so even though they speak English and often work with wizards, they also have their own language, which is gobbledygook. I don't think we ever see them speaking gobbledygook in the movies, but there's many occasions in the books where that comes up and where they're speaking gobbledygook, and that needs to be translated by wizards. Some wizards know how to speak that language. The goblins have their own type of magic. So they don't use wands. They're not allowed to use wands, but they're able to do magic without a wand. And something that's really different from another thing, I guess, that's really different from witches and wizards is they're able to continue to use their magic after death as ghosts. Whereas a wizard that's a ghost can't use their magic. Like, for example, like Nearly Head Listening for a person, or the Ravenclaw ghost, or any of those ghosts, like they're not doing magic, whereas a goblin ghost can, apparently. But we never see that in the books, so that would be interesting to get into that lore. But anyway, I won't go too far down that road. Goblins are adept metalsmiths known for their silverwork, ironwork, and they also mint coins for wizarding currency like galleons, sickles, nuts. And each coin is stamped with a serial number, which identifies the goblin who cast that coin. So money, I feel like, is talked about a lot more in the books, and that kind of comes up a lot. And like how it's so different from Muggle money and stuff like that. I feel like I don't think they really get into that in the movies too much, but they have their own currency, and that's all created by goblins. The sword of Gryffindor, the Godric Gryffindor sword, is a goblin-made sword. That's probably the most like iconic goblin-made object that comes up again and again in the books. But there's a lot of other objects too that come up, but that's just like the main one, and we're going to talk about that a lot with this Griphook storyline in this episode. Another fun fact is the Firebolt broomstick features goblin-made iron parts that provide greater stability to the broom. So there's some objects that you might not think actually even have any goblin-made parts, but they do, like the broomstick. So going along with this creating things, you know, ironwork and silverwork, goblins are smarter at wizards at identifying counterfeit goods, like leprechaun gold and, for example, the fake sword of Gryffindor, which we'll talk about later. And goblins control the wizarding economy to a large extent, which is kind of crazy because there's just so many issues with goblins and wizards, and they're kind of like looked down upon by many wizards, but they also control like the money of this world. So it seems like they would have more power there, but they definitely have more influence than, let's say, elves, for example, but there's still like a lot of issues. Okay, so goblins, they run Gringotts Wizarding Bank, obviously. But it's important to note that wizards also work there, like Fleur and Bill both work there. And other people, like we see the guards at the front, those are wizards. There's many cultural differences between goblins and wizards. So even though they both tend to speak English, and there's a lot of similarities, there's also a lot of differences, and that causes a lot of tension between the two races. And that's something that's key that I think like the movies just really doesn't get into, and it like kind of makes a lot of stuff with like Griphook not make sense. So it's important to just realize like goblins are a different species of being. They operate differently than wizards, even though they're like operating in the magical world alongside wizards. They shouldn't exactly be like thought of to be thinking and acting the same way. The Goblin Liaison Office of the Department of the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures in the UK manages the affairs between wizards and goblins. And as I've alluded to, there's just a history of many goblin rebellions in the wizarding world and a lot of issues and tensions between wizards/witches and goblins. So that gets mentioned a lot throughout the books. They talk about that in like History of Magic. They talk about how goblins are very different. Like they've stood up for themselves a lot more than like house elves, for example. And they like, that's kind of like a subplot. Another thing is Ludo Bagman making a bet on Harry to win the Triwizard Tournament. He made that bet with goblins to try to settle his previous gambling debts. And he ended up losing that bet because technically Harry didn't win outright. He tied with Cedric. And the goblins are going to go by that. So there's just a lot of issues. And it's like kind of like a sub thing going like throughout all the books that I don't think really gets addressed in the movies. But it's just important to understand that because that as we're getting into Griphook, that's going to explain a lot of the reasons why he does what he does. I will say the Hogwarts Legacy game, which I haven't really gone into in this podcast, and maybe I can do an episode on that. But that video game, if you've played it, you know that goes more into the story of like the goblin wizard tensions and some of the rebellions that have happened, and even goblin characters that are mentioned in the books. So if you're interested in more of the goblin storylines, that might be a place to get that because we don't really get that so much in the other content. So that's our little goblin background. So let's go into Griphook specifically. So etymology. Griphook is his name. I don't think he has a surname. It seems like goblins don't. They just have like the one name. And then if we break that down, so grip and hook. Grip is to hold things tightly. And obviously his profession has him guarding riches. He values treasure. And then hook is a sharp claw-like feature, often used for catching or stealing. And I think that's a reference to like him taking the sword and him being involved in this big bank heist and things like that. So his name is very much kind of like a description of what he does in the plot of Harry Potter as far as his profession and some of his storyline. It seems like that's the background. I couldn't find anything with Griphook as a name specifically. So let's go through Griphook's character timeline. So on July 31st, 1991, we get introduced to him as the audience, and Harry meets him for the first time. He is the goblin that takes Hagrid and Harry to Harry's vault and Vault 713 that has the Sorcerer's Stone in it. He works at Gringotts until 1997. So this is through the first book, all the way through the seventh book. He's continuing to just, be a goblin that works at Gringotts. Then in 1997, we know the Ministry of Magic falls to Voldemort's kind of regime, and wizards are actually put in charge of Gringotts and in charge of all the goblins. So that didn't super sit well with Griphook, as well as a lot of goblins. Think of goblins as being not necessarily on one side or the other with this wizarding world, or they just want what's best for them. And a lot of them did not like having wizards being in charge of them. Griphook gets assigned to put Godric Gryffindor's sword, quote unquote, in Bellatrix's vault. He and another goblin, they notice that it's a fake because they're goblins, and they can notice counterfeits much better than any wizard or witch can. But they decide not to say anything because they're obviously unhappy with this regime, and they just put this fake sword into Bellatrix's vault. That becomes really important later. So just a little bit of thing that happens kind of outside of Harry's storyline. Sometime after that happens, Griphook goes on the run to avoid this wizarding control, as I mentioned, that he doesn't like. He meets up with a couple other people. So Gornock is another goblin, Dirk Cresswell, and then later he meets up with Ted Tonks and Dean Thomas. So this group, the 5 of them, spend several months on the run together. Because this is, remember, like this is book 7. This is during the time when there's a lot of prosecution against anyone who isn't full wizard. Or, I mean, I think the Half-Bloods are okay, but Muggleborns are not doing so well. So like Ted Tonks and Dean Thomas are definitely in danger. Same with Dirk Cresswell. So a lot of people are on the run that aren't just like Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And then these goblins that ran away from wizarding control as well. So this group is on the run, camping out, like, going along their way. There is a moment where they actually cross paths with the trio, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who overhear them talking about certain things and get some news from them. That all happens in the book. So this group spends several months on the run together and eventually gets caught by a group of snatchers that's led by Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf. Fenrir Greyback is like a pseudo Death Eater. He's not allowed to be a Death Eater because he's a werewolf and those are looked down upon, but he's still like pro Voldemort and his movement because he thinks it's better for werewolves. So he's leading a pack of pack. I guess maybe that's the right word, a group of snatchers. And they capture Ted, Dirk, Gornuk, Griphook, and Dean. Ted, Dirk, and Gornuk are killed, but Griphook and Dean are the 2 that escape and survive. So when the trio gets snatched, which they get snatched by the same group of snatchers with Fenrir. So Harry, Ron, and Hermione get grabbed by them, and they get tied together in a group with Dean and Griphook, who have already been taken. And then that whole group, so the 3 of them plus Dean and Griphook, get taken to Malfoy Manor. In the movie, this is a little bit different. In the movie, Dean's not included at all. And Griphook is just like already at the Malfoy Manor for some reason. And it's not really like explained how he got there. So when they get brought to Malfoy Manor, Hermione gets tortured by Bellatrix when she realizes that they're holding the Sword of Gryffindor. And she thinks that they broke into her vault and she's like going crazy. The rest of them get put in that underground cellar thing, like so Griphook and Ron and Harry. And Harry persuades Griphook in this moment to corroborate their story when he gets questioned by Bellatrix to identify if the sword is real or not. Harry asked Griphook if he can please tell Bellatrix that the sword that they have is a fake, even though he knows it's the real one and the one in her vault is the fake. He needs her to believe that she still has the real sword. So Griphook agrees. When he gets questioned by Bellatrix, he tells her that the one that Harry and Ron and Hermione have is a fake. And this is kind of like his best moment, I would say, probably. He did this. It was very interesting that he did this for Harry, but I think he definitely has a different opinion of Harry, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Griphook's legs end up getting injured during all of this, and, we know Dobby rescues the group. They all go to Shell Cottage, which is Bill and Fleur's home. Fleur, while they're there, cares for Griphook and heals his legs with Skele-Gro. And obviously, big spoiler alert, Dobby dies during this rescue. And Griphook stays in his room, but he watches from his window as Harry manually buries Dobby, like digs the hole and everything. And when Harry comes to talk to him, he calls Harry an unusual wizard for digging Dobby's grave and for going out of his way to save a goblin, along with the rest of the group when they were escaping Malfoy Manor. This is where Harry then drops the big question. So Harry, with Ron and Hermione in the room, asks Griphook if he'll help them rob Gringotts. Basically, Harry has put it together that the Hufflepuff cup, there's a Horcrux in the vault, because that's why Bellatrix was freaking out so much, that she thought someone had broken into her vault. So he now knows that they need to break into her vault. He needs help from Griphook because Griphook has knowledge of Gringotts. So he asks him if he'll help, and he understands a little bit that like Griphook values treasure and doesn't, even though he's not working at Gringotts anymore, he's still kind of faithful to Gringotts and wouldn't want it to get robbed. So he tells him, like, I'm not trying to steal anything for personal gain. Like, I'm not just robbing her vault just to rob her vault. Would you believe that? And I think that's my favorite quote from Griphook. He said, if there was a wizard of whom I would believe that they did not seek personal gain, it would be you, Harry Potter. This is super telling of how Harry is super unique in this story and has kind of more of the personality of Lily, and is just an odd wizard in the wizarding world. He's seen as very odd because his behaviors are kind of not with the status quo, and how he treats these beings that are supposedly lesser than him. And, so it's just interesting. And that it's interesting that Griphook clocks this in his like very few interactions with Harry. Griphook takes some time. He doesn't agree at first, but he takes some time, and then like a couple days later, he finally agrees to help them break into the Gringotts. And his condition is that they give him Gryffindor's sword. So Harry, Ron, and Hermione are faced with this difficult decision of, do they give the sword of Godric Gryffindor to Griphook? This brings up some history about the sword and who does it rightfully belong to and all that. But really what it comes down to is they don't want to give up the sword because the sword is basically their only means of destroying Horcruxes. Horcruxes are extremely hard to destroy. There's very few substances and means in the world to destroy them. I think that it's important to really remember that. Like, Godric Gryffindor's sword isn't even naturally a Horcrux destroyer. The only reason that it can destroy Horcruxes is because it impaled a basilisk, and basilisk venom is able to destroy Horcruxes. So when we're talking about all these Horcruxes getting destroyed, most of them are being destroyed essentially by basilisk venom, like that we see, like the ring, the cup, the locket, the snake, even, are all being destroyed by either like a fang directly or the sword, which is embedded like with the basilisk venom. And then we see fiend fire, which is incredibly dangerous to use. It's totally out of control. So Hermione like wouldn't even think to use that, or she thought to use that, but she's like, I wouldn't even chance it. And then we know like Harry gets Avada Kedavra, and he's like a weird example. But yeah, so that's why, like, just to really hone down the point here, giving up the sword is huge. Like, they don't have access to things that can just destroy Horcruxes. Like, they would have to go to extreme measures to try to find something else. But they also need to get the Horcrux in the vault. So Harry decides that what he's going to do is he's going to agree and tell Griphook that he'll give him the sword, but just not agree to any timeline. And his thought is, I'm not being dishonest. It feels wrong, but he feels like I will find a way to get this sword to him one day when we're done killing destroying all these Horcruxes. And I just cannot give it to him right now. So that's what he kind of privately with Ron and Hermione. Ron's fine with it. Hermione thinks it's wrong and doesn't really agree, but goes along with it. And so they go back to Griphook and they tell him that they'll give him the sword, and he agrees. So then they start planning. I feel like in the movie, it feels like this is like the next day, but they spend weeks planning how they're going to break into Gringotts, and Griphook is giving them all these tips and telling them about all the security that's at the bank. So after they spend weeks planning this heist, they tell Bill and Fleur they're going to leave, and they go to Gringotts. They manage to break in, get into the vault. Griphook, basically, once they find the cup in the vault, Griphook grabs the sword and just runs, and the vault gets opened by the Gringotts goblins, who know that they've broken in. And Harry realizes that he never believed that they would just give him the sword. He doesn't trust wizards because of all of the history between wizards and goblins. So he just like runs and leaves. And Griphook, as he's joining the goblins, he yells thieves, and he points at the trio, and they just kind of accept him into their group and don't question that he was part of the heist at all. In the movie, this is different. So he makes Harry trade the cup for the sword in the book, and like they make it more like this is a betrayal, but it's not really in the books. I mean, kind of, because he just like he was a thief with them and he runs off, but it's kind of like there's no honor amongst thieves. You can't really expect him to have your back when you had this like shaky alliance. But anyway, either way, he leaves them in the vault and takes the sword, and they have the cup. And then from there, as far as Griphook's story, in the books, we don't see him again. Like, he just runs away and leaves the vault, and we don't really, like, his fate is unclear. We don't really know. Maybe Voldemort could have killed him. Maybe he escaped. It's not, like, we don't get, like, the closure on that. In the books, they make it super clear that he gets killed by Voldemort. Like, you see his, like, dead body lying there and the sword disappearing. So I think, up to your interpretation on what happens to him. There's a good chance he was killed just because this is a time when they're in war and a lot of people are getting killed. So, but that's the end of his little timeline. His biggest part is obviously this whole heist and, the interaction with the trio in that 7th book. It's kind of weird. He's like appears in the 1st book and then the 7th book. So let's get into theories about Griphook. First of all, there's a lot of confusion among fans about who is the rightful owner of Gryffindor's sword and who was at fault as far as Harry versus Griphook. For background, so as discussed before, there's a lot of mistreatment of goblins by wizards. Like, wizards refuse to allow goblins to carry wands, and they don't share like the secrets of wand lore with goblins. And even though goblins can do magic without wands, could be the argument, but in goblins' eyes, they could expand their magic and do more with wands if they had that chance. They could extend their powers. It's important to like understand that there's a lot of tension there. Outside of like Griphook and Harry specifically, there's just a lot of tension in general between wizards and goblins, which I mentioned before. Secondly, this is really important, and this gets covered in the books, but is totally not discussed in the movies. So I think movie watchers or people who haven't read the books in a long time, you're like, Griphook's just a bad guy. You don't realize how they see ownership differently. So wizards have different feelings of ownership of items than goblins do, and goblins in their eyes feel like wizards have stolen treasures from them. So Bill Weasley in the books does a really good job of explaining this to Harry, that for some goblins, many goblins, especially goblins that are associated with Gringotts, they see the maker of an object as the master or the owner of that object. And then when the maker sells that object to a person, like, for example, with Godric Gryffindor, they make this sword. This sword is supposed to be made for Gryffindor. Gryffindor purchases it. They see it as renting it to him. And they think that when he dies, he should give it back. Like, it's like a lease agreement. Like, it was agreed for him to use that in his lifetime and he should give it back. They think that Godric Gryffindor passing this down, this being like objects, treasures being passed down through generations with families or whatever the case, they see that as stealing. Like, you tried to rent something and then you just kept it for yourself. That's really important to understand. And it kind of gets brought up a little bit too with like Fleur wears this tiara for her wedding that's a goblin made tiara. And that was kind of a thing that got passed down from the great Aunt Weasley. And Griphook doesn't like that that's getting passed around between wizards. This keeping of items without further payment is considered stealing. So in Griphook's eyes, this is a stolen artifact from his people, this Gryffindor sword. So that has nothing to do with Harry. He knows he's not thinking that like Harry specifically stole the sword necessarily. It's just that this is a stolen object that like wizards shouldn't be keeping. It should have been returned to goblins, or more specifically the goblin that made it. So the goblin that made Gryffindor's sword is a goblin named Ragnuk the First. So Griphook believes that Ragnuk the First was the rightful owner and should have been receiving extra payments when Gryffindor is like passing this, or the sword should have been returned. Also on the side of Griphook and this like argument, to get Griphook to help him, Harry promises to give him the sword. Harry did make a promise there that Griphook was going to get it. And Harry does, on Harry's side, Harry does intend to eventually give the sword to Griphook. He's not, he didn't actually agree to a timeline. He hasn't broken any promises by not like giving it to him the second they get into the vault. I can see like both sides. It's more just like a miscommunication between like who's the rightful owner and like who's at fault, Harry and Griphook. Like they both kind of, just like with all the wizarding and goblin tensions, there's fault on both sides. Like Harry was being a little bit deceitful. Griphook was maybe being a little bit deceitful and like just mistrusting. And yeah, so I just think there's a lot of blame placed on Griphook. Harry's the main character. People don't want anything to be done like that could be seen as against him. But I feel like people shouldn't go so hard on Griphook because he in his mind, he's acting like he's doing the right thing and trying to recover the stolen artifact. He's not just like, oh, I hate Harry Potter and whatever, and screw him kind of thing. Next fan theory is that if Griphook had survived, he would have had a redemption arc. Obviously, a lot of thoughts here. First of all, we don't really know that he didn't survive. Let's talk about the use of the word redemption arc. I think we'll use that a little bit too loosely. You know, to have a redemption arc, a character has to go from bad and then do enough to redeem them in the eyes of the audience. The best example I can think of a like well done redemption arc would be Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. I hear people say that like Draco Malfoy has a redemption arc, and I want to make it clear he does not have a redemption arc. He does some redeeming things. He has some redeeming qualities. He's not all bad, but we don't see him do a bunch of things to come back from all of his wrongs that he does throughout the 7 books. We see him in the end, in the epilogue, but it's like, and he's supposedly good, but like we're not given a redemption arc for Draco Malfoy. Let's just be clear. So this whole like Griphook would have a redemption arc, like Griphook would like come back around and whatever. Like, I don't think we're just using this term too loosely. Like, everyone doesn't need a redemption arc because either they're some people are just going to be bad, but also like some people just don't need it. Like, I'll give it to you. Griphook is not the nicest person / goblin. In the books, they mention a lot that he has like more of an interest in violence. He has I'm not sure if that's a personality trait or like a goblin trait. It could be just a response to continued mistreatment of goblins. But he does seem like he is more inclined to like want to use the unforgivable curses when they're doing their heist. He is more happy about the idea of violence. In the first book, even when Harry asks about like what happens if someone like a thief gets shut in a vault, and he's like laughing or smiling at the idea of like someone being locked in there and saying they check like once every 10 years or something. So obviously that person would be dead. So he just like seems to have a little bit more interest in violence. So that's like not great. There's a quote from the books. Harry realized that he did not much like the goblin. Griphook was unexpectedly bloodthirsty, laughed at the idea of pain in lesser creatures, and seemed to relish the possibility that they might have to hurt other wizards to reach the Lestrange's vault. Yeah, like Griphook's not the best guy, but I don't know. Like redemption arc is kind of a lot. Like I don't think he needs redemption, I would say. Because like I said before, like in his eyes, he's working with untrustworthy people and he recovered a stolen artifact. And he did help them in many ways by not telling Bellatrix that the sword that was in her vault was a fake, and by lying to her again when they are in Malfoy Manor saying that their sword was a fake, and then telling them all this stuff and genuinely helping them break into Gringotts to get this Horcrux. They really did need him. So he did help a lot. So it's like he's just a complicated character, not necessarily a bad guy, like many, many, many of the Harry Potter characters. So I don't know. I think this is people who think that like he needs a redemption arc or that he's just straight up a bad guy. I think you're seeing him as a little bit too flat. And granted, if you have more recently watched the movies or whatever, they do make him pretty flat, or like they don't make him as complex as they kind of do in the book and giving all like the background. So let's talk about Griphook in the movies. He's played by Vern Troyer and Warwick Davis, mostly Warwick Davis. Vern Troyer in movie 1 is like playing the bank teller. His voice gets dubbed over by Warwick Davis though. And then Warwick Davis does him for movies 7 and 8, which is like the Deathly Hallows part 1 and 2. And the only reason why Vern like the dub over was because the original movies wanted an all British cast. They didn't want the American accent. And it seems like the new show that's coming out is getting away from that, where they are casting Americans. But I think they're still like doing the accents. And then last fun fact about Vern Troyer, I'll say, is that he's known for playing Mini-Me in Austin Powers. So you've probably seen him in that. And then obviously Warwick Davis plays up multiple characters in Harry Potter. We talked about him playing Flitwick, for example. He's Flitwick in all the movies. Even though they kind of changed his appearance, it's always Warwick Davis. But Warwick had extensive prosthetics to play the Goblin, Griphook. He even has like fake teeth you can see in the movie. In an interview, Warwick actually said he liked the depth of the character of Griphook and felt that he was more complex than Flitwick, which if you do read the books and get into like all of his background and the background of goblins, I do agree. Like I think he is a much more complex character, or we just don't get too much on Flitwick. Griphook, we have him in these really like he's a complex character, and then we have him in these like interesting scenes, especially with the 7th book, where you're having this like battle between him and Harry a little bit, and that's like representation of battle of like wizards and goblins. In the audiobooks, so they have those recent audiobooks where it's like the full cast edition. The voice actor for Griphook is someone named Doc Butler. What I thought was interesting is Doc Butler, he does Griphook, but he also voices a bunch of the like more minor characters in the audiobooks. So he actually appears in books 1, 3, 4, 5, and 7. So if you're interested, he in Prisoner of Azkaban, which is 3, he plays a tiny wizard aboard the night bus. In Goblet of Fire, he plays Dragon Handler 1 and Elf 1. And then in Order of the Phoenix, he plays Augustus Rookwood, Old Bearded Man Ghost, and Death Eater 2. And then obviously voicing Griphook, he puts him in 1 and 7. If you have listened to the new audiobooks, maybe try looking out for those different characters and see how they compare to Griphook. But that's all I have on Griphook. So thanks for listening. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to this podcast wherever you are listening. And until our next episode, happy reading, happy listening, and may you never be caught stealing from a goblin.